Watching a special edition of World Insight, coming to you on the sidelines of the China Development Forum. I'm Tian Wei. As the China-U.S. trade negotiations continue this week in Beijing, we are talking to a whole range of American figures for their unique perspectives. How do we avoid the worst-case scenario and work for the best potential, for example? That's what rational minds are thinking these days about China-U.S. relations. Among them, Graham Allison, the founding dean of the Harvard University Kennedy School of Government. Many believe his academic work on how to avoid the Thucydides Trap, namely a war between the incumbent power and the rising power, is extremely relevant today. In our interview, he minced no words about the third-party factor issue. Are we getting closer to a war, or actually we have found a way to avoid it?
So I do not think a war between the U.S. and China is inevitable. I don't even think it's likely, but I think it's certainly possible. And unfortunately, I believe the likelihood that some third party's action drags us into a war is greater today than it was when we talked about this time last year.
Third party action, what exactly you meant?
So in the Thucydidean dynamic between a rising power and a ruling power, the way war normally happens is not one or the other thinks war is a good idea. Instead, some third party's action that's extraneous becomes a trigger that produces a spiral of reactions that ends where nobody wants to go.
And what are you worried about these days if there are third parties?
Two triggers that are at the top of my list. First, Taiwan. If Taiwan makes a move towards independence, you could easily see a scenario like 1996. North Korea. If the North Korean freeze that's currently on collapses and Kim Jong-un goes back to testing ICBMs, Donald Trump may attack him.
But you know, Professor, on these two factors, the U.S. attitude, particularly now, is extremely important. Washington particularly should not embolden the pro-independent factors in Taiwan. Otherwise, it's even more dangerous than we are thinking right now.
That's what I believe, and that's what you believe, but that's not what Washington believes. So if you
Washington, what part are you talking about right now, Professor?
I'm saying if you look at the legislation, 6 separate pieces of legislation, from the Taiwan Travel Act to the Asian Reassurance Initiative that passed in December, unanimously, that is, there's not been a single voice, Republican or Democrat, standing up against legislation that's basically encouraging Taiwan to take a more independent stance. And I think that's very dangerous.
That, of course, coming from the Capitol Hill, what about the bureaucracies that have been handling the issue about Taiwan throughout the decades? One
of the terrible facts about the way the Thucydidean rivalry between the U.S. and China has evolved is that China is now officially designated by the bureaucracy as a strategic adversary. You can read this in the national security strategy, in the national military strategy, so this is not a secret. And so if you're my strategic adversary, the ability to make things more difficult for you by nudging Taiwan a little bit is a temptation. Now, I believe it's a very dangerous temptation. That's what I say publicly to people in Congress. That's what I say to the administration. That's what I said to people in Taiwan when I was there in December.
Professor, what about the other factor, the DPRK factor you earlier mentioned? I was in Hanoi covering the Kim-Trump summit. We were talking about this earlier. The question really is, what's next? Will Washington remain rational, particularly at the time when Washington is leading up to election as well?
Well, I think President Trump very much wants to reach an agreement with North Korea. And he's decided that he doesn't have to solve everything in order to solve something. So I think they came fairly close to a big agreement that wouldn't have been everything, but would have been a big step towards denuclearization at Hanoi. I think, unfortunately, the preparation maybe was not appropriate, or I don't know exactly what happened. So I'm hoping that this will get put back together again. I even think China could play a very active role as a broker in this, because China has a great interest in no nuclear North Korea.
China earlier has proposed the double track, as you may know, to denuclearize while at the same time peace and stability, and try to seek a peace mechanism on the Korean Peninsula. However, we haven't seen different parties move equally.
Your point is exactly right, but the U.S. has now adopted China's proposed recommendation to go step by step. So currently we have freeze for freeze. Then you could have another step by step, synchronized. Before Washington was not in favor of that. Now that's the policy of the Washington administration. Thanks for China. I'd say that's very good. But in the current situation, President Moon in Korea is much more active in trying to find solutions than China is. Well, why should that be? China is a bigger, stronger power. China has a great interest in this. So if I were offering advice to the Chinese government, I would say, you're a big player. This is in your neighborhood. You can help play this hand, and you can help President Trump find a way to an appropriate place. So I would go back to the conversation between Trump and Xi at Mar-a-Lago, their first conversation. They talked very candidly about Korea, and Xi Jinping knows a lot about Korea. So I think this is an opportunity for China.
Well, we do not know yet when the heads of state from China and the U.S. are going to meet.
I hope soon.
What kind of role will the negotiation play, Professor Allison, from your perspective? The one currently going on right now about trade, apparently about trade at least. What role will they play in terms of avoiding the Thucydides Trap, which you've been putting so much effort in over the years?
So I'm hopeful on the trade front. I think the trade conflict is heated up, but I think that they're within striking distance of an agreement. I would bet that there's an agreement in the next month or two. I hope even sooner. And I think the agreement will be signed by, or be announced by Xi and Trump at a summit. We'll have to see. But Liu He, the Chinese negotiator, has been very active, has been Lighthizer and Mnuchin. So I think they're getting down to the fine details. I think this will not be the solution to all the problems, but it'll be a big step forward, showing how the U.S. and China can actually deal with tensions. And I suspect the trade conflict will continue, and I suspect the rivalry between the U.S. and China will continue. But our challenge is to manage it, not to let it run away with us.
Right. But you know, Professor Allison, all our talk is based on the fact that Washington last year, in 2 white papers, identified China as a so-called strategic rival. But the question really is, when China is being pragmatic, you heard that word over and over again at this year's China Development Forum. Can Washington also become or maintain its spirit of pragmatism? After all, that's what U.S. has been doing from the very beginning of its rise toward today. The question really is, will Washington be able to modify and adjust to the real reality as the realities evolve? That is the question. As we all know, it's going to be a lose-lose game. Everybody knows that. Right. It's just the fact that, can we realize it with policies?
Americans' DNA is pragmatism. So Americans are normally and naturally pragmatic. Unfortunately, our politics sometimes is a little wacky, and often then leads to extremes. But I, in the end, believe Americans will be pragmatic about this. I think the question, in a Thucydidean dynamic, the reality is China is rising and is going to continue to rise. And it's rising not because of the U.S., not because it wants to do something to the U.S. It wants China to be great again. It wants China.
And there's nothing wrong about that.
And excuse me, what could be wrong with this? The idea that Chinese used to have $2 a day, and now 99% of them have been raised above that, that's a great achievement. The fact that Chinese have 10,000 per capita today, why shouldn't they have 20,000? They should be proud to.
China's per capita is 9,000 per year, while the U.S. is 60,000. Yeah. There's a huge difference between the two. So why Washington wouldn't understand this?
Or 30,000? Why shouldn't they? Well, that's going to happen. So that's one reality. Another reality, Americans are accustomed, after an American century, to being at the top of every pecking order. So inevitably, as China gets bigger, it's encroaching on American positions, or positions Americans think, well, that's been our prerogative, that's been our position. So you look and you say, just at this conference today, who's the biggest automobile market in the world? Excuse me, Americans invented automobiles. America should be the biggest. No, China is the biggest. Well, why? China has 4 times as many people as America. Surprise, just a little bit of arithmetic. So, but is that adjustment going to be difficult? Extremely difficult.
So, Professor, from your perspective, besides the crisis we might face, what could be some of the solutions now?
We should recognize the systemic risk that emerges from the structural reality of a rising power to a ruling power. So we have to be very realistic about the risk and very realistic about the third-party actions. And then we should say, what can we do together?
What can we do together, Professor? I mean, I do not know about this because if you look at the business community, they have a lot of things they're doing together. But these things are not being advocated inside the United States right now. People are saying, oh, Chinese are taking away everything, but they fail to look at that the American businesses are only having a huge market here in China. Well, the two countries' businesses are working together on many projects, and they are aspired to do even more, given the recent policies of opening up financial sector and many other issues. So, Professor, don't we have a lot of things to work together? But why are we always fail to look at the areas that we are really working together?
We should be more vocal about those and should shine a light on them more. It certainly is a case that there are many, many American businesses here who see China as a fantastic market for the U.S. I talked to a dozen people yesterday, for each one of whom they say, well, China is our biggest market. Take Daimler-Benz, the Mercedes. China is their biggest market.
That's
Amway.
A European company.
That's a European. Amway is an American company.
Right.
China is their biggest market.
But you have a white paper that you said earlier, talking about China as a strategic rival. That baffled all the business community. They do not dare to talk. They do not dare to talk about their work together with China.
Well, the business community has been quieter than it should be, I think. Been quieter than it should be. When in the strategic...
Of course, they have their own concerns over the years that we understand.
They have many things to complain about, but businesses complain always. They complain about Washington. If they're in the U.S., they complain about China. But I think they haven't been vocal enough about their shared stakes in what's happening. I think we need to look at the areas where cooperation between us is essential, because then we'll have perspective on the areas in which there'll be obviously strong differences. So, for example, in avoiding a war between the U.S. and China, our interests are identical, since the war would have an equal effect on both of us. So we can work on that. Climate. If the climate is ruined for China, it's ruined for the U.S. If it's ruined for the U.S., it's ruined for... We haven't worked on that. Managing the global economy. In 2008, we would have had a Great Depression if it wasn't for China and the U.S. working together. So there's a lot of areas in which we can work together.
Professor, from now till next year, there are likely to be a lot of things happening. In China, in the U.S., between China and the U.S., and elsewhere in the world, which work could be a third factor in your words. What do you think is the most pragmatic spirit? I would like to ask for your advice for all sides, both sides rather, China and the U.S., if they can.
The North Korean issue will have either come to some agreement or not. The trade issue will have come to some agreement or not. American politics will be heating up because the election will be simply 6 months away. And the Democrats will be running very hard against Trump, and maybe even to have positioned themselves to the right of Trump on China, blaming China even more. So I would suspect the noises will get louder and louder, and I think the thing that sensible people should be doing is asking, where do we have shared interests, And what can we do to protect those shared interests, but in particular to prevent some third party causing us to do something we don't want to do.
Professor, what a pleasure seeing you once again. Thank you so much, as always, for your insights.
Thank you so much for such an interesting interview.